In late March, a $30 million U.S. Department of Education grant was announced by the University of Evansville and other local officials. The grant's purpose is to create more educational opportunities within the Promise Zone region of Evansville. What does that mean for local students? That's next on WNIN Newsmakers. I'm April Nading, filling in for Amy Mangold. Evansville received a Promise Zone designation back in 2016 to support its most at-risk neighborhoods within its urban core. The aim of this new grant funding is to assist children and youth who are growing up in Promise neighborhoods, providing them with access to outstanding schools as well as family and community support systems. Our first guest is here to discuss the potential impact of this grant. Chris Petroskevich, president of the University of Evansville. Thanks so much for being here. Can you describe the Promise Zone neighborhood area?
Sure. It consists of about 10 census tracts and 6 schools, so there's about 3 or 4 zip codes that's associated with it. And it was done by an independent consulting group that looked at school data, census data, to help us figure out what was most in need in Evansville, and we targeted that population, in large part because we've applied for this grant a couple of times before, and the feedback that we've received was that we needed to be more targeted and be able to then scale it up in the future.
Well, why did U of E want to be involved with this project?
Well, it comes back, I think, to the history of the university. We came to Evansville because the city raised money to bring us here. We started in 1854 in Moores Hill, Indiana. We moved here in 1919 when the city raised $500,000. So I
didn't know that.
So we feel like we have a responsibility back to our community, and this is one of the ways that we get to pay it back. I think our community is better when our university is better, and our university is better when our community is better, and this is a really big step for us.
And probably part of the goal is that maybe you can work with these people to help them maybe attend U of E down the road.
Yeah, sure. Certainly a pipeline program is a part of it. There's really 4 building blocks that go into the Promise neighborhood aspect. One is kind of early childhood intervention. Second one is success while they're in K through 12. The third one is creating that pipeline and affordability to colleges, including the University of Evansville, and we have some programs in place that will help students be able to do that. And the fourth one is in enhancing the community and the neighborhood in which the Promise Zone exists.
And probably not just the being able to afford college, but also the interest. Are you probably also trying to create interest in college?
That's one of the issues, not only in the Promise Zone, but all across the country and even here in Indiana. Only about 55% of people that graduate from high school go to college.
Wow.
And so we want to be able to increase the level of education that happens not only in Evansville, but also throughout Indiana and throughout the country, and this is one of the ways to do it.
Now, what will U of E's role be in administering this grant?
So there'll be about 40 positions that are associated with administering really $62 million in community development. 20 of them or so will come from existing positions from some of our 23 partner organizations, and 20 or so will come as new positions that will be housed at the University of Evansville. So the university, as the lead agent on this grant, will house the Promise Zone staff in the Center for Innovation and Change and administer the whole grant process for all of the schools and the neighborhoods involved in Promise Zone.
So you said you're going to have to do some hiring at U of E in order to implement this. So what is your timeline on when you think this is going to take off and start be implementing these things?
Well, it's interesting. The Department of Education informed us last week that they're giving us $30 million over 5 years, and the grant begins the following week.
Oh.
So this is going to happen pretty quickly. We have some programs and pipelines already in place with our community partners, but we'll staff up our hiring practices very, very quickly to make sure that we're utilizing that first $6 million of Department of Education funds. And it also comes with $32 million in grant funding that comes from our neighborhood partners. 23 of them have contributed mostly in-kind services, in addition to the $30 million coming from the federal government. So this will be a $62 million investment.
Wow. So that was one of the things I was going to ask is who are some of the community partners that are going to be working on this with you?
Well, the lead partners have been EVSC. They're the primary beneficiary, particularly because of the location of the 6 schools in the neighborhoods. The EREP has been such a great partner. The mayor's office has been a great partner. And Promise Zone, so Silas and his team have been really instrumental in putting this all together. So there are 4 or 5 kind of core partners that have worked on this project, but there are 23 others that have been a big part of this and have contributed either in-kind services mostly or cash that allows us to be able to do the 1+1 match. So the department would not have funded this had we not had a community willing to put up $32 million to match the 30 coming from the Department of Education. There were only 3 awarded in the country this year, and Evansville was one of them.
So is this something they do award every year?
They have been doing it, I believe, since 2014. Typically 3 or 4 of them a year. Evansville was the only one that received the maximum amount of $30 million this year.
Really? Now, what do you attribute that to?
Well, I think we've learned from some of our past applications. We've done this 3 or 4 times before. We have been very involved in those that have been awarded Promise neighborhood grants in the past. So we pick up the phone and we call people and say, okay, tell us how you were successful.
What did you do? Right.
Exactly.
Rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, right?
Right, and so we learned every time we submitted a new application, and this year we kind of got it right. And the key, I think, was as a targeted populations. It wasn't trying to make everything better. It was trying to figure out how we can take the areas of biggest need within Evansville and try to make it a little bit better.
Which in turn will affect everything. It's like throwing a pebble into the water, the ripples.
Well, I don't think this is just a 5-year project.
Right.
Right. I think we start with the 5-year project and we target 6 schools in the Evansville Promise Zone. The impact is community-wide. I think this is historic for the University of Evansville, but I think this is even more historic for our city. We have a sustainability council, and what that means is once the grant funding ends in 5 years, we don't want the services that we're putting together to go away. So we have a group of leaders in the community that have already agreed to serve on the Sustainability Council to help us figure out how we continue to sustain what happens over the course of the next 5 years, long after the federal government's funding ends and the commitments by our partners have ended. So we want to make sure that we still continue to provide $5, $8, $10 million of support services long after the 5-year program is over.
But is it something, could you reapply? I mean, just because, or is this a one-time only thing? I mean,
well, there is other grant opportunities through the Department of Education.
Okay.
I don't think there will be a renewal that will happen as part of the Promise neighborhood, but if we're successful in administering a $30 million grant from the Department of Education, I think it opens up funding that exists from the Department of Education and others in Washington to be able to help us sustain programs like this in the future.
But was the Promise Zone neighborhood, when was that implemented exactly?
So Promise Zone neighborhood was about 10 years ago.
Okay.
And so that was a designation that the city applied for. And
to apply for this grant
to
initially?
Apply, so there's 2 different grant programs.
Okay.
One is the Promise Zone.
Okay.
And the Promise neighborhood falls within the Promise Zone. So the city was the overarching implementer, along with the Promise Zone, which has its own organization.
Okay.
That really was the precursor for a Promise neighborhood.
Okay.
So if we didn't have a Promise Zone, we couldn't have a Promise neighborhood. So the city had to make that choice with the help of a lot of people a number of years ago. That was the precursor to allowing us to be able to apply for a Promise neighborhood grant, which is much more specific.
So what is your hope for the outcome of this grant?
Well, I think it's to make the community better than it is. If you think about the 4 building blocks, they all start with the word improve. It's improve early intervention. It's improve successes for K through 12. It's improving access through post-secondary education. It is improving the neighborhood and the community. So if we can accomplish each of those goals, and we have lots of other metrics that we'll use to be able to measure success, because if you can't measure it, you can't figure out whether you're successful.
Right.
We want to be able to make sure that we're being able to measure the success of the program. $62 million is a big investment, and we want to make sure we use it wisely.
Right. Well, hopefully it's very successful. Thank you so much for being here and talking about this today.
You're very welcome.
Now joining us are representatives of the EVSC to talk about what this means for the schools within the new Promise Zone neighborhood. Kim McWilliams is the Chief Officer for Family School Community Partnerships at the EVSC, and Derek McKillop is the Director of Community Learning Centers. Thanks so much for being here. Which EVSC schools are in the new Promise Zone neighborhood?
Yeah, there are 6 EVSC schools in the Promise Neighborhood grant, and they are Evans in Delaware, and then also Lincoln, Lodge, Glenwood Leadership Academy, as well as Bosse High School.
How were they chosen?
That's a great question. So if you think about where they're located at, they're really a centralized location within the neighborhoods, and the census tracts that we kind of looked at where students live and what schools that they attend. There's a saturation from those 6 schools where they then live within that school boundary, but also in a certain centralized neighborhood area where many of these community partners, over 20 community partners, will be working with these families and students for wraparound supports.
So what are some of the plans that EVSC has for this grant funding?
Yeah, so EVSC has always been committed to the idea of community schooling. Currently we have 22 schools throughout the district that receive various funding streams that support programs and initiatives which would increase student learning and development. I think this grant provides a real opportunity for us to increase the resources that are available, to further build upon the strategies. And I think it's important to note that this is going to happen both at the school level, but also there's going to be a real importance in developing these strategies within the community. We have over 20 partners that are working on this grant, contracted to work on this grant, and there's going to be a real emphasis on duplication of what's going on at the school, and building that in the community, and really this sense of bringing everyone together, getting everyone on the same page.
So have you already picked the families that are, how is that decided? Who will be using this?
Yeah, so it'll be the students that attend those schools, but then also working with the neighborhood associations and all the different partners that Derek just mentioned that we'll be having, over 20 collaborative partners, identifying what their needs are. So obviously when they're in the schools, they'll be receiving after-school programs perhaps, or any other programs that are taking place in the school setting. But then as well, when they're in their neighborhood, they'll also be receiving those wraparound supports that are taking place in the neighborhood. It could lead from early learning, from the cradle to career type emphasis to college and career. So lots of different pipeline strategies will be taking place in many different areas.
And when do you expect all of this to start?
Yeah, so as you've covered, this is one of the most competitive grants that's available. We were one of only 3 designations in the entire country. Evansville as a city has never received a grant of this proportion before. So I think amongst the core team, those that have been involved in securing this grant, there's a real emphasis in making sure that we do this the right way. So we're going to take our time, make sure that we are thoughtful and intentional about the planning and the implementation stage. I think we can start to expect some of the early stages of the rollout maybe towards the end of the calendar year, but I think it's important to stress that it's not something that we want to rush into. We want to take our time and be deliberate and intentional about making sure that we set ourselves up for the best chance of success moving forward with the entirety of the work.
Yeah, and it is a 5-year designation. So starting, it begins now, but we want to go slow to go fast throughout those 5 years and make sure that we have everything in its right spot for that continued improvement process within this Promise neighborhood area.
Well, what do you hope the impact will be on the families and the children who are involved?
Yeah, we definitely want to leverage this funding for the success of our students and families. And the things that we're looking at highly are, how do we get that early learning program in place with the partners in our neighborhoods that are in a right spot to do those things? And then as they run into EVSC schools, how do we continue that pipeline of success and then on into college and career moving forward? So many different programs are going to take place from, are they in school? Are they achieving while they're in school? What type of opportunities are we providing for them out of school time at our after school programs that we have available, making sure that we have the right people in place as far as partners at what we call site councils that meet and work with our schools on what needs that each of those 6 individual schools might have and how they can meet those needs.
Well, and it seems like the word family is used a lot with this. How do you try to get the families to embrace this? Because I would think that's part of the problem sometimes with some of the neighborhoods.
It is. I'll start, and Derek, jump in, please. With the families, one of the things in EVSE's continued improvement process, we had what we called empathy interviews with over a couple thousand different families, employee groups, and where we really sat down almost like this and had conversations with them, built those relationships, which then led to the trust. And then the families understand that all these partners, EVSC and the other over 20 partners, are working together with them, not doing something to them. So we want to make sure that it's a collaborative effort, knowing that we're all in this together, and we want to see those improvements on a long-term scale.
Yeah.
Do you want to jump in on that? Or what kind of measuring stick will you be using to determine whether your success rate is on this?
I'll start with the evaluation process.
Okay.
There will be an evaluation process, and the US DOE, the United States Department of Education, highly wants that and held accountable to that. And in our proposal, we put down some of the things that we will be looking at. Some of those will be the attendance rates. How many families are attending those family engagement events? And what are those family engagement events held at the schools and at what we're calling community hubs, to make sure that we're not just having it somewhere where if there's a barrier as transportation, that a family may not be able to get there. We want to remove all those barriers and have that access available to all families throughout. We'll continue to work at how many after-school programs, how many students are attending those out-of-school time programs, because we know when they are attending those programs that they're more likely to have that sense of belonging in our schools and then attend, which then leads to engagement, which leads to achievement, not only during the school, but then also, as we talked about, this is a cradle to career program, so it's post-secondary success as well.
Okay, so I guess also you have the 5 years, but you're going to be evaluating during that whole time. It's not just something at the end of the 5-year term that you're going to say, oh, this was a success or a failure.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. So every single strategy that we'll employ, both in the schools and in the community with our community partners, every one of those strategies will be independently evaluated. There will be progress reports submitted to US Department of Education twice per year, which gives us very real feedback as to how those strategies are performing. I think the other thing that is unique with this type of grant is there is a degree of flexibility. So we can assess internally what strategies are working well, and that will give us the opportunity to leverage further investment and maybe employ additional strategies within that pipeline, increase the frequency that those strategies are being offered. So yeah, although it is a massive grant and a monumental undertaking, there's very real feedback that comes through our evaluator, through the analysts of each of those strategies, and then it gives us the ability to increase upon any one of those.
Okay.
So yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much for being with us. We're out of time, but I appreciate your input.
Thank you.
Here to talk about the economic impact of this grant is Tara Barney, CEO of the Evansville Regional Economic Partnership, and Silas Matcham, Director of the Evansville Promise Zone. Thank you both for joining us. So I'm going to start with Silas. Could you tell us what area comprises the Promise Zone and what is your role with the Promise Zone and the new neighborhood grant?
Well, the Evansville Promise Zone consists of 11 census tracts across the city of Evansville. It stretches from Franklin all the way over past Riverside, over across the street into the Glenwood neighborhood, past Lodge and things of that nature. So it's got a pretty big footprint, about 24,000 individuals within the Promise Zone directly that I'm responsible to make sure that we are striking on 6 particular goal objective areas, which are crime, job development, health, education, economic development, and housing. And in between that, my direct role is to make sure that we're facilitating the resources, building those processes, building those collaborations that allow us to make those necessary connections to bring in economic development across the board, such as Promise Neighborhoods, which is a big benefit to the community.
It's a lot, isn't it? And I guess one of my questions was even who's herding all this? Who's going to actually kind of herd the cats to make sure this is all organized?
Well, it's really the University of Evansville being the physical agent, the seeker of the grant, but it's a lot of collaboration. Grateful for Jeremy Evans from Dream Center, who helped navigate and bring the groups together, then also working with all the 22 different partners that makes this possible for us to receive such a huge and grant in terms of funding.
So Tara, what are some of the expected economic benefits of this grant?
Well, certainly for this community, the opportunity for these families, these young citizens and their families, their parents, to have a coached and supported path to moving through their education and into productive opportunities to build careers and work in this region is the number one benefit that I think this can provide, because with a great job and a great career, the opportunities to stabilize and support your family and your neighborhood and all the other factors that Silas has appropriately mentioned get easier.
So it's not so much that you're trying to keep people here, but ideally you would like to keep them here.
You bet.
And right, and so I guess that's part of the goal.
Well, certainly we are very interested in having this region be as sticky as it possibly can, not just for folks that we want to come here, and we certainly are serious about that, but most important for the people that make this home and have for generations, because they're our number one targets, if you will. And we want every young person here to have a great choice, and that choice might be to go away for a couple years. That's okay, as long as they come back.
Gotcha, because it is a great place to live.
It is.
So have you already seen some positive outcomes just from the designation in 2016?
Well, there's been a lot of opportunity, things that come with our Promise Zone designation. And when you think about Promise Neighborhood Grant, it was one of those initial grants when the designation came about to really infuse that economic impact, although you had to apply. So a lot of people don't realize that we're a round 3 Promise Zone designation. So there was a round 1 and a round 2. And most of the robust work that took place between round 1s and round 2s were predicated on the Promise Neighborhood Grant. So we're getting our opportunity now to get that infusion of economic impact through this grant in a round 3 opportunity. And that is really what's going to bolster our designation moving past even its 10-year set, because this is a 5 years which will outlast our 10-year designation. So now we're moving beyond our Promise Zone designation with this opportunity.
Because there was already the Promise Zone, right?
correct.
And then the Promise Zone neighborhood, right?
Yes,
Okay,
there's-
so now you actually get to do more.
Right.
You're already doing some things.
Yeah,
but
there are a
it's-
lot of things taking place within our current Promise Zone designation that we've been doing over the 10 years, working with our community partners, looking for opportunities to help our partners work in their particular missions, because the idea of the designation itself is not to be the face, but actually to be that middle, that resource, because the work after the designation has to continue. And the ones that are going to continue the work are the partner groups, is the EREP, the University of Evansville. These are the ones that are all going to consistently be here. So making sure that we're providing that necessary resource, such as now the Promise Neighborhood, really puts us in a place to continue this work for years to come.
Which is ideal.
Yes.
So I know the grant mentions the ultimate goal of having good careers for the children who are in the
Yes.
Promise Zone. So how important is that to our region?
Well, I'd be understating if I didn't say that every employer in this region wants and needs more talent to be part of their organizations and part of this community. And we're in a time in this state's history, in our region's history, we don't have quite as many children being born, moving up that pathway, and so it's really important that we are double down, if you will, on helping every one of our children have great options. And no one is interested in telling or over-guiding a child toward choosing A or B, but we've got some great career options here. And sometimes they're a little amorphous unless you provide a lot of wraparound support to help young people identify those things that they really have a passion about. And so we're very committed to helping do this work, not just to serve employers, but to really enrich this region.
Well, and I guess that would be one of the questions, though, is are those careers available here now and are not filled, is what one of the things you're saying.
We've got thousands of jobs open right now that we don't have candidates to fill. And I could go down the list of major manufacturers. I could go down our school systems. I mean, we've got so many career opportunities that, you know, we want to make sure every family that needs a little help getting their child into early child care or whatever, we're working on that, because everyone that we can give a choice to be back in the workforce, we're interested in doing just that.
So what happens next? I mean, it feels like everybody's going to be hitting the ground running.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, what are you doing? What happens now?
Well, the lead organization, which is the University of Evansville, is currently going through the process of getting all their things set up in place to administrate the grant. And we're reviewing. We have executive committee teams that work weekly on figuring out how do we actively put this in place. And then once we get those processes figured out, you'll start seeing more about who's getting what and receiving the activities that are taking place within the Promise Zone designation. So it's really like you'd spend all this time preparing, because you're talking about somewhere between 7 to 8 months of putting this grant together for a submission. Then you're talking about an additional 3 to 4 months or so waiting to hear back, maybe a little bit longer. And now you're at the point of, wow, we have it. Now we have to put in place all the things we said we would do. So it's going back and looking at all of our partners, having conversations with them one-on-one to basically remind them what they said that they would do.
Remember when we talked months
Exactly.
ago?
And then getting to a place where we can get into implementation stage.
Well, it sounds pretty exciting, and I would think a lot of the families are excited. I mean, I'm just wondering what kind of interaction you've had with them about this, or.
There has not been any formal interaction to my knowledge at this particular point. We are having conversations about going out and doing some town halls, because I know that's the big question. What does this really mean for the community?
Right.
And we do need to answer that question for the people that we will be serving. And we're looking at working with some organizations, putting some things together so that we can make those connections with the community at large.
Okay.
But we really do know, though, I mean, these 22 partners at Salas's Group, they've been working together for years, successfully.
Right.
And so we know some of these wraparound services that President P talked about, you know, they work.
Good.
And, you know, so
We're gonna make it
Dream
work with
Center,
this.
among others, have been doing this work, and this is a chance for us to take it to scale.
All right. Well, thank you both for being here.
Sure.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us to learn more about the recently announced $30 million federal grant to assist lifelong learning in Evansville's Promise Zone. Thanks for watching WNIN Newsmakers.